Thanks. That's a compelling and very interesting analysis, and I appreciate it. I guess I'm wondering whether and how it's possible to get back to an actual international legal order. I mean, I think, one of the problems, one of the corollaries of the problem of the rules-based order is that it's yet another chip at universal international law, where there's, of course, other things chipping it from the authoritarian side. So, I mean, is a revived, assuming, this rules-based order can be continually exposed, as you describe it, for the sham that it is, how do we get back to something akin to universal international law that works?
It's a great question. What you essentially are telling me is, stop admiring the problem, tell me what the solution is. And you're quite correct.
What do you see as the way forward?
Yeah.
What might happen?
Let me say this. We are working on a project at the Quincy Institute in which we brought together 125 scholars, academics, former officials from 42 countries to look exactly at this. And it's very clear. Right now, the political will and the sense of urgency does not exist in the manner that is needed in order to be able to make the kind of changes that are necessary. But as in the next 10 to 15 years, first of all, there will be a realization everywhere, including in this town, that the world is undeniably going to be non-unipolar. Whether it's bipolar, multipolar, we can set aside that conversation. And while there will also then be the realization that unless there is something done to be able to make sure that there is still a universal order and that we don't go towards a multi-order world, because we have to recognize, if we do transition through inaction towards a multi-order world, then we will see great power competition in the worst possible way between the United States and China. It will feed into that gravitational force rather than resisting it. At that point, I think that's when we will start seeing the political will to be able to make changes. I think it is widely recognized that if we were today trying to reinvent international law from scratch, we would end up with a far worse version than currently exists. And in some ways, that's actually not bad news, because it means that we actually have something that is pretty good if implemented equally and universally. So there is a solution out there. It's whether we are willing to accept that in this future world, the key to, particularly then the United States, since the United States is one of the key obstacles, the key to American security is its ability to coexist with other great powers.
Thank you. Still over here, Red One.
I thank you, Trita, for a really compelling presentation. I'm really curious about where this phrase came from, the rule-based order. Who invented it? What do they mean by it? Who makes the rules in this order? It's really fascinating. Just like came out of nowhere. And can you tell us more about what do they mean by rule-based order and who makes the rules?
Excellent question, Radwan. So towards the end of the 2000s, Kevin Rudd, Prime Minister of Australia, who I believe is actually ambassador to Washington right now, started using this term, and it was in relation of how to deal with a rising China. It did not at that time have any of the implications that it had later on taken on. Then we started seeing some people in the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, starting using the term, but also at that time in a similar vein as Kevin Rudd was doing it. Then it started changing. And then suddenly by 2015, there is like this massive increase of its use, particularly in academia as well. And it is very much related to China. Then during the Trump years, you didn't hear much talk of this at all, because it's too sophisticated of a term for many of the Trump administration officials to wrap their heads around. But in many ways, what they were pursuing was not particularly different. It's just a more brute version of the same thing, but without the veneer and intellectual framework around it. But what you have seen in the last couple of years, in particular, is the most worrisome aspects of it. Because as Dugard and many others are pointing out, increasingly, This is not an alternative. This is not building on international law. There are elements of it that you can say is part of soft law, but it is increasingly being formulated and treated as an alternative and a threat to international law. What is also fascinating is how a lot of countries around the world, including in the West, Europe, completely bought this, thinking that it is no different from international law and the UN system. And we're treating it and speaking of it interchangeably. We have, in the last year, even before Gaza, started to see a shift in that. Countries like Japan no longer sign on to joint statements with the United States referencing rules-based international order. Instead, they're insisting that it should say the rule of law, which is a reference back to international law rather than the system. And this is because of a campaign, I don't know how systematic, but a campaign by certain global South countries challenges this term upfront and kind of sensitizing Western countries what actually is being meant here. And it is not as simple as just a faster or nicer way of saying the international UN system.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I totally agree with many of the things, especially the double standards. But if we need to put that in perspective, remember in 1956, the Bounding Conference in Indonesia was the birthplace of the Non-Alliance Conference. And at that time, Islamic scholar, famous Malik bin Nabi, put all his faith on that conference, where three countries, leading countries, Egypt at that time, India, and Indonesia. And now, fast forward to this point, which some people actually they compare the BRICS country, but still we see that those bloc is not homogeneous.
It's not.
Especially the role of India. Well, that's important because now the three countries who leading the global South is India, Brazil, and South Africa. But you see that the position of India on Gaza is very disappointing and it's completely different on the historical position of India. This is why my point here that we should not put too much faith on building as alternative to what the United States was historically was able to build as international based order, because the alternative is still not clear and they don't have even compound reliance on even on the Gaza as the India confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a very good question. I think what I'm trying to put forward here is that the alternative is not a continuation of a status quo in which the old system essentially remains in place. It is already being eroded. We're reaching a point in which there has to be a decision in which direction we will go. And if there will be a decision to try to revive some of the positive elements, particularly if it's more evenly implemented of the old order, that has to be a conscious decision. Now, you're quite right in regards to India's policies, and it's not just in terms of what is happening in Gaza. But I don't see that necessarily being an argument as to why we do need to have significant revisions in terms of how international law is being applied. I think in a multipolar world, India is going to be an extremely assertive country. It is starting already for quite some time to try to put itself outside or try to exercise the same exceptions that other great powers also have done. The question is that if you have a world in which you have a larger number of countries that have the ability or the desire to be able to do so, what will be left of international law if there isn't some concerted effort to be able to tie all of them, instead of just some of them, to specific norms and laws and make it very costly for all of them to be able to violate it, which will be higher than what it is today. Certain very powerful countries can do so today precisely because too many other countries cannot. If we're in a world in which many countries can, it's going to change the calculation, I think.
Take the last question and we're going to have to end it. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for your speech. My question is in regards to Iran's current regime, in particular in regards to the rules-based international law that you've brought up. What's your take on how the regime is trying to play its hand, or in other words, like when you mentioned that Biden administration's definition of it is who is willing to subscribe to this law, does that basically give birth to outliers such as Iran's regime to not obey this rules-based law, or just interested in knowing your take on how is Iran trying to play this?
So a country like Iran is already not abiding but by what the US defines as the rules. And Iran is violating international law on a consistent basis. We saw, for instance, the strikes against Iraq and then Pakistan very recently, which incidentally is the Iranians applying the very same norm that the United States tried to put in place after the global war on terror, in which the definition of self-defense against terrorist organizations, however you define them, it's very gratuitously defined by many actors in order to be able to invoke that norm. So you have the Iranians on the one hand doing so. On the other hand, it's very interesting if you compare Iran's conduct today and the way it tries to justify its actions compared to how it acted and how it framed its policies back in the 1980s. It is quite a significant shift. That shift already happened in the 1990s. Take a look at, for instance, the justification they put forward for retaliating against the Israeli strike against the Iranian consulate in Damascus. They immediately invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter. And they're referencing these different things. Whereas back in the 1980s, the Iranians were a completely anti-status quo country that viewed the United Nations as an instrument of American imperialism that was being used by the United States to impose its will on other countries. There's a very fascinating shift that has happened, not just in Iran, but also in the global South as a whole, who tended to have similar views, but now increasingly view the United Nations and international law as a tool, instead of being bound or as an instrument that is used by the United States, is an instrument that they can use in order to bind not just the US, but other great powers.
Thank you.
Okay, Trita unfortunately has to go right now, but I found this talk incredibly insightful, thought-provoking. The one question I have for him before he goes is that going to be published sometime soon so we can read the text? What's the plan?
It's going to take another 6 to 7 months minimum, but it will be out. And when it is out, we certainly hope that you read and share it.
Okay, please thank me.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. 13. Yeah, of course.
Okay, the floor is open for questions.